This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 23, In the Shadows. The sun beat down mercilessly on James's head and shoulders, the humidity causing his ragged clothes to cling to his back. He unconsciously pulled at the worn fabric as he mopped his forehead with his sleeve, squinting as he peered up at the cloudless sky. He had to look the part. A desperate man seeking refuge from the life of bondage that he had supposedly fled. It was partly true. Perhaps that would make his story more convincing. He was indeed a slave, and even though he didn't have the muscles of a field laborer, he still had earned the calluses on his hands. As he saw the British encampment appearing in the distance, James clenched and unclenched his hands, steeling his resolve to move forward. They had no reason not to believe him, he reminded himself. He just needed to stick to the fabricated narrative. When he got close enough to be within sight of two guards posted without the encampment, James feigned a stumble in his step, his expression weary and defeated. "Halt!" barked one of the soldiers, stepping forward with a hand on his musket. "State your business." "Please," James cried out, his hands raised in a sign of peace. "I'm an escaped slave. I've run away from my master's farm to find freedom." The two guards exchanged glances, not looking too surprised by the announcement. James was sure that it was a somewhat common occurrence for escaped slaves to be seeking refuge behind the British lines. But still, the taller officer eyed James with a degree of suspicion. "Where do you come from?" "I came from a plantation near the York River," James replied, purposely keeping his answer vague. If they knew that he'd come from a plantation in New Kent, over 50 miles away, it might raise suspicion. Besides, he wanted them to see his knowledge of the local area as a possible asset. "I've heard that the British protect men like me," James added. "We do," the man said, "assuming they are what they claim to be." He jerked his head to gesture that James follow him. "The general will know what to do with you." Heart pounding, James followed them past the camp's outer perimeter. The smell of campfires and damp earth filled the air as they walked between the rows of canvas tents. Redcoats moved about, paying them little attention. James was led to a larger tent at the heart of the camp. A pair of British officers stood outside speaking in hushed tones, but after exchanging a few words with the guard, one of them disappeared inside. Several agonizing minutes passed, and James felt anxiety curdle in the pit of his stomach. If this didn't go according to plan, he might be dead before sunset. Finally, the officer reappeared and gave a nod. The general will see him. James noted the lack of enthusiasm with which the officer spoke the title. It was clear that he did not have a great deal of respect for their commanding officer. Squaring his shoulders, James stepped inside. The tent was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of ink and sweat. Sitting behind a desk strewn with correspondence and maps sat a stocky figure, robed in a scarlet British uniform. He must have been in his early 40s, with a round face and a prominent forehead. He wasn't a particularly handsome man, but he had a commanding presence, with sharp bluish-gray eyes, only heightened by the intensity of his expression. James noticed the tension around his eyes and the stiffness of his posture. So this was Benedict Arnold, the man who had nearly single-handedly sunk the American cause, now living out his promised position in the British Army. James couldn't help thinking that this was a strange meeting indeed, a false traitor confronting a real one. Arnold leaned back in his chair, and James noticed that he had one leg propped up slightly, no doubt the leg that he injured in the Battle of Saratoga, before he'd defected. "So," Arnold began, "you claim to be an escaped slave, seeking refuge with the British?" James bowed his head slightly, his voice measured, as he recounted his false story of escape. "I heard that runaways can find protection under the British flag. Arnold narrowed his eyes, his fingers tapping on the desk. Heard from whom? James hesitated only a moment before answering. Word spreads quick among the slaves, General. Arnold seemed to appreciate his use of the title. Since his treachery, Arnold was now both despised by the Americans and unpopular with the British. You came from a plantation, you said, Arnold pressed. What work did you do on this plantation? I served in my master's house, tended to him, managed supplies, and carried messages when needed, among other tasks. Arnold raised his eyebrows in sudden interest. Messages, you say? Can you read? Some, sir. And write? Arnold asked. A little, General. Enough to keep accounts when I had to. The truth was that having been a manservant, James had learned to read and write both English and French, but thought that it would be wise not to fully reveal his abilities. Arnold nodded, exchanging glances with an officer posted near the door. That might be useful. He studied James a moment, finally saying, You say you manage supplies. That means you used to keep track of things. Provisions, weapons, men coming and going. James nodded. Yes, I paid close attention to whatever my master needed me to handle. Arnold rubbed his chin. You're not the first runaway to come seeking refuge here, but I don't trust men easily. If you are lying to me, you'll regret it. James bowed his head slightly. I understand. I only want to serve the king's forces and earn my freedom. Arnold paused, then addressing the nearby officer said, Take him to the quartermaster. Get him settled and keep an eye on him. Turning his gaze back to James, he added, You say you can be useful? Then prove it. As James was led out of the tent, he felt a great sense of relief, but immediately reminded himself that this was only the beginning. If he was going to get the information that General Lafayette needed, he had to earn the British's trust and learn their secrets without raising suspicion. He quickly realized that he had signed up for perhaps the most dangerous role that he could have. But with that risk came perhaps the greatest chance to make a difference and to sway this war decisively. William Goldman's classic book, The Princess Bride, tells a compelling story of adventure, romance, revenge, and above all, true love. The movie that was made from the book is one of the most beloved and quoted films in the fantasy adventure genre. As the plot unfolds, we follow Princess Buttercup, Wesley, Indigo, and Fezzik as they overcome intense obstacles and dangers on their quest. There comes a point in the book when things look especially bleak, and the author addressing the audience says, Life isn't fair. It's just fairer than death. You see, you've made the classic error of expecting life to be fair. It's not. This is reminiscent of Wesley's line in the film, Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something. Now, this may seem like a cynical perspective, but William Goldman is correct. Life is not fair. He illustrates this through his characters, who often suffer unjustly. Indigo loses his father as a young boy, which leads him on a lifelong quest to avenge his death. Twice, Buttercup thinks that she's lost the man she loves, while facing marriage to a prince who she despises. Wesley is a prisoner aboard a pirate ship. He also gets tortured and killed before he comes back from the dead. And it seems that the author is trying to teach us that life is full of injustice. Some people come into life with terrible disadvantages, but what matters is how they respond to those trials. It is not about where the story begins, but where it ends, that determines everything. 1780 was one of the most difficult periods that the Patriots faced during the Revolution. The fall of Charleston, a devastating defeat for the Continental Army, was followed several months later with the biggest blow yet, the betrayal of Benedict Arnold. This treachery blindsided the Americans. Had Arnold's plot to surrender West Point been successful, the Patriots would have lost their most important military post, along with the capture of their commander George Washington. It was only through heaven-sent intervention that the plan was foiled, If you want to know more about that, you can listen to my 14th episode. But morale was at an all-time low among the Patriots. The young Marquis de Lafayette had gone back to France for a year, and his return to America in 1781 brought a much-needed boost of hope and momentum to the American cause. Lafayette was a uniting force, and his unbridled enthusiasm and commitment was contagious. Most importantly, he brought with him the support of the French, which would be critical to their victory. After Benedict Arnold turned traitor, he was given a position in the British Army and commanded troops in Virginia. He led a brutal raid on Richmond, burning military supplies and destroying Patriot infrastructure. In early 1781, Lafayette was sent by Washington to Virginia with 1,200 men. He was charged to do everything he could to frustrate the British in that quarter and to capture or kill Benedict Arnold if he could. And Lafayette may have been successful if Cornwallis had not arrived and taken over Arnold's command. But what Lafayette didn't realize was that Washington had an ulterior motive for sending him to Virginia. While constantly asserting that he planned to attack New York, Washington secretly planned to trap Cornwallis in the South. Even in correspondence, Washington did not tell Lafayette his real plans, knowing that the British might intercept those letters. So in essence, the French Major General, without knowing it, was sent to pave the way for Washington to come and join him later, so that they could create a concentrated attack that would hopefully force the British to surrender. Because Lafayette had limited men at his disposal, he decided that information would be their best weapon. He formed a spy ring to try and work behind enemy lines. This operation worked in tandem with Washington's existing spy network, but Lafayette was also able to use French officers and sailors as informants, and he specifically recruited enslaved African Americans, which isn't surprising. If you've listened to my episodes on Lafayette, then you already know about his character and his hatred of slavery or discrimination of any kind. But one of the most valuable agents that he ever recruited was a man by the name of James Armistead. Armistead is a surname that comes from his overseer, William Armistead, so it's not something he would have actually been known by outside of maybe official documents. You see, James was born into slavery around 1748 in Virginia. Talk about a grossly unfair and disadvantageous start in life. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of details about James's life before the war. Many of the conclusions that we draw about his upbringing come from deductions and secondary sources, but most historians agree that it was likely that James worked as a manservant rather than a field laborer. This would have given him access to education that he otherwise would not have had. It's possible that through this he learned to read and write both French and English. William Armistead owned a plantation in New Kent, but he also worked as a state-appointed military supply officer for the Patriots, managing logistics and provisions for the war effort. This position would have put William and possibly James in regular contact with American officers, including the Marquis de Lafayette. And if James was William's manservant, he would have had access to valuable military discussions and strategic information, making him a prime candidate for espionage. What we know is that in 1781, James received permission from his overseer to join the Patriot cause, and went to work under Lafayette as a spy. Now, whether or not James was actually educated, it's apparent from his actions during the Revolution that he was incredibly intelligent and resourceful, and Lafayette clearly trusted him implicitly, because he assigned James with a very dangerous task: to infiltrate Benedict Arnold's camp, posing as an escaped slave. You see, the British in November of 1775 had sent out something called Dunmore's Proclamation, which promised that any slave who escaped from a Patriot master would be granted freedom in return for British military service. Note that slaves owned by Loyalists were not included in this, because the whole point was to try and undermine the American cause by weakening their economy, creating discord, and, of course, gaining additional support for the British cause. So this was a tactical, not a moral move. If it had been an act of morality, they would have freed all the slaves. Keep in mind that the British had control of the colonies before the Revolution, and were actually the ones to implement the slave trade in the first place. The British still allowed slavery in their own empire, and many British officers and officials were enslavers themselves. But still, thousands of escaped slaves fled to the British territory, which created the perfect cover story for James Armistead to get behind enemy lines. As the war went on, the Americans actually extended some similar offers of freedom to enslaved African Americans who fought for them as well, but it varied depending on the state. Rhode Island, for example, formed the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was composed mainly of formerly enslaved men. And in the end, more enslaved men who joined the Patriots ended up gaining their freedom than those who fought on the side of Britain. Because despite the British's sweeping promises, thousands of those who had fled to their side were abandoned as the British withdrew their forces, left to be recaptured and re-enslaved. But as James became ingrained in the British camp under the guise of joining them, he became privy to information that would have been unthinkable otherwise. He gained the trust of Benedict Arnold, and then General Cornwallis when he replaced Arnold in Virginia. And it was under Cornwallis that James became a double agent, the first double agent in American history, feeding correct intelligence to the Americans and misleading intelligence to the British in order to confuse or misdirect their movements. It was an incredibly perilous role, and at any point it would have been only too easy for James to betray the Americans. But he didn't. He stayed loyal, and because he did, he was able to deliver information that helped to bring the war to its conclusion. James moved carefully through the British encampment, keeping his head down and his steps light. Soldiers lounged outside their tents, speaking in low voices. Some tended to their weapons, others played cards. James passed through them unnoticed, his thoughts turning. By now he had become accustomed to the British's routines, and he noticed many of the senior officers making their way to the general's tent. He knew what it meant. They'd likely be making plans tonight, and James intended to be there when they did. He moved casually, but his steps were purposeful as he made his way to the supply tent. Inside, he grabbed a tray, setting a bottle of brandy and several pewter cups onto it. Assigned to the officer's tent, James had learned that they always appreciated a drink while they strategized. He had worked hard to make himself indispensable over the past months, always available to carry water, tend to the officers' horses, and deliver messages. He also served meals, which frequently brought him within earshot of their discussions. Carrying the drinks, James strode to the large officer's tent. Adjusting his grip on the tray, James pulled aside the flap and stepped inside. The tent was spacious. The air was still stiflingly hot from the lingering heat and humidity of the day. A thick rug covered the packed earth, and the officers were gathered around a wooden campaign table, studying a large map of the Chesapeake. Cornwallis sat in the center, leaning forward as he listened intently to what his men were saying. His eyes glanced up briefly as James entered, but his attention quickly returned to the conversation. James silently went about pouring their drinks, being mostly unacknowledged by the officers. The deep-water port that the Chesapeake offers is a perfect location to receive reinforcements, one officer observed, leaning over the detailed map. Cornwallis nodded. We'll have to move more forces down. New York and Philadelphia won't be of use. The Americans will be distracted thinking that we're heading their way. We'll need a place to hold, another officer added. If we can secure a strong defensive position, we can interrupt the Americans' growing strength. Cornwallis scoffed. The Americans are a rabble of farmers and traders who fancy themselves soldiers. The French are our concern. He slammed his hand down on the table. Capturing that blasted boy would be the fastest way to crush their enthusiasm for this rebellion. I'd love nothing more than to send him back to England in chains and see what the French make of that. James knew that the boy Cornwallis referred to was Lafayette. At 23, the French Major General was a child in their eyes, and Cornwallis had for some time been intent on capturing him. Lafayette was the connecting link between the French and the Americans, and the British knew it. "Never mind the French," another officer interjected. "We just need to outlast them." Cornwallis rose, stabbing a finger at the map. "Yorktown has plenty of fortifications, and being next to the Chesapeake will allow us to receive reinforcements. Graves will send his fleet to the bay." Cornwallis suddenly looked up at James, who straightened from pouring a drink. "James, tell us, are the Americans prepared to fight us at Yorktown?" James kept his mouth slack, giving a respectful nod. "They seem scattered, sir. Not much order among them." Cornwallis smirked. "That sounds about right." He turned his attention back to the map. James stepped away, his expression betraying nothing, but his mind raced with the new information. He silently poured more brandy into one of the cups, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate. He busied himself with cleaning up the tent a little, knowing that leaving too early would arouse suspicion. The officers were now talking about their plans for the next few days, rations, troops, and reinforcements. But none of it mattered now. The key details had been given. The British planned to make their final stand at Yorktown, and they were counting on the Navy to secure their position. If the Americans and French could act quickly, they might have a chance to trap Cornwallis before his reinforcements arrived. As the conversation wound down, James took the opportunity to slip out. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching him as he made his way toward the shadows. The camp was quieter now, the soldiers focused on their own duties. James moved quickly, repeating the information that he had just learned in his mind to ensure that he forgot nothing. He kept his pace quick but cautious. Since becoming a false British informant, he'd been able to move freely between camps, but he knew better than to become complacent. Under the cover of darkness, he worked his way past the outer patrols. He'd become accustomed to trekking across country under the cover of night, but this time he moved with even greater caution. This message had to reach Lafayette, and soon. When he came within the bounds of the American camp, the sentries hailed him, before recognition dawned and they rushed him to Lafayette. The Major General greeted him with his usual enthusiasm. "James, my friend," he said in his thick French accent, "what have you found?" James quickly relayed the British's plans, how Cornwallis had chosen Yorktown as his stronghold, the reliance on Admiral Graves's fleet, and the belief that the position was unassailable. Lafayette listened carefully, his elbows resting on his knees as he soaked in the new information. "This is exactly what we needed," Lafayette said. "Washington and Rochambeau must hear of this. If we act quickly, we might yet have the upper hand." But James's work wasn't over. As the siege began, he continued to infiltrate the British lines, gathering updates on their dwindling supplies and growing desperation. Each time he returned to Lafayette with new information, the American and French forces tightened their hold. James was watching from a hidden position as the British marched out of Yorktown. The defeated army laid down their arms, their flags furled, as the combined American and French forces looked on. James saw Cornwallis's second-in-command offer his sword in surrender, a symbol of the British's defeat. As he stood alone in the shadows, James's heart swelled with a quiet pride. He had played a significant part in this victory. Very few understood his role in all of it. Perhaps few ever would. But in his heart, James knew that freedom wasn't won in grand gestures alone. Sometimes it was won in the quiet moments, in the courage to listen, and in the risk to speak. The intelligence that James Armistead delivered to the American and French forces was pivotal to the success of the siege of Yorktown, and ultimately, the American Revolution. James relayed information about Cornwallis's plans and troop positions in Yorktown, allowing the Americans to know their vulnerabilities and act accordingly. At the same time, he was feeding misinformation to the British, leading them to believe that they could hold out longer than they actually could. This gave Cornwallis a false sense of security as the Americans closed in. But perhaps James's most important discovery was that the British planned to receive reinforcements via the Chesapeake Bay. Because of this, the French Navy was able to create a blockade that kept the British from receiving additional troops and supplies. This forced Cornwallis's surrender in 1781, and it was this decisive victory that broke the British's resolve to keep fighting, leading to the negotiations that resulted in American independence. No one knows how much longer the war might have gone on, or if the odds may have changed without this victory. But there is no doubt that James's efforts made a monumental difference, if not all the difference, to their success. After the war, many African Americans who had fought as patriot soldiers were able to claim their freedom, as promised by their specific states, but not James. Having worked as a civilian spy, there was no guarantee of freedom for those who performed non-combatant roles. Because of this, after the war, James went back to being a slave. Now, it seems impossible that anyone could have so completely overlooked James's role, and that a mere technicality could have kept him from earning his freedom. But fortunately, not everyone forgot about James's contribution. In 1784, Lafayette made another trip to America to see the nation in its independent state and to visit George Washington at Mount Vernon. While he was in Virginia, it seems that he heard about James's continued enslavement, and he wrote a letter to Congress describing the service that James had rendered and asking for his freedom to be granted. He wrote, "This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligences from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him, and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Done under my hand, Richmond, November 21st, 1784, Lafayette." It's likely that James and Lafayette met again in person while on this trip, or that Lafayette had the letter delivered to him because James used this letter to petition the Virginia legislature for his freedom in 1786. He did this, it would seem, with the support of his overseer, William Armistead. In his petition, James humbly asked that he be granted his freedom, based off his services in the Revolution, expressing belief in the natural right to freedom, and asking that his enslaver, from whom he'd experienced everything which can make tolerable the state of slavery, be compensated. The legislature chose to grant James his liberty. No doubt a key factor was the personal testimony from the French Marquis, who was widely considered a great military hero. So James began his life as a free man. And in honor of and gratitude toward the person who helped him gain his liberty, James took the last name Lafayette, becoming known from then on as James Armistead Lafayette. He became a farmer, purchasing 40 acres in Virginia, a piece of land that was actually adjacent to the property of his former overseer. Based on some of the secondary sources, it seems that James started a family, and actually purchased several slaves himself, possibly family that he was trying to protect. The details about James's life after the war are limited, but what we do know is that in 1819 he applied for a pension, which was granted, and it seems he lived a quiet life. I wonder how many people in his day ever understood what he had done to pave the way for their freedoms. But as the years passed, there was at least one person who understood the risks that James had taken and the sacrifices that he had made. James worked his way through the crowds gathered in Capitol Square, the sounds of cheering and applause almost deafening. Richmond was packed with people, and James had to rise to his full height to try and get a better view of the procession moving down the street. Thousands had gathered to welcome the returned hero, and James was determined to see for himself. After making his way closer to the street, James finally caught a glimpse of the aged Marquis de Lafayette, General Lafayette, as he remembered him, arrayed in a military uniform and sitting confidently upon his horse. His presence was every bit as commanding and regal as James remembered. His friend had aged a great deal, as had James himself over the nearly 40 years since they'd spoken, and seeing Lafayette again brought back waves of memories, recollections of danger and espionage. But above all, James's heart swelled with gratitude. He saw the returned hero not just as a deliverer of this nation, but as his own personal liberator. Then, unexpectedly, Lafayette's head turned, his eyes scanning the crowd. His gaze fell upon James, and he pulled his horse to a stop, halting the procession. Lafayette dismounted, slower and with greater care than he had as a young man, but he moved with purpose through the crowd. "James," he called out. Amazed, James smiled as Lafayette approached, his heart swelling with emotion as the old Major General pulled him into an embrace. The crowd looked on in equal wonderment, seeming to know that they were witnessing something significant. As Lafayette pulled away, expressing his admiration for James's role in the Revolution, James felt tears prick his eyes. Lafayette then turned to the crowd, saying, "This, my friends, is a true hero. Without him, our victory at Yorktown might never have been secured, and in turn, your freedoms." The public acknowledgement made the tears spill down James's cheeks as emotion overcame him. He knew then that even if no one else ever did recognize his contribution, in this moment he was seen as a hero, and his efforts were not forgotten. Even in his own day and time, James Armistead Lafayette was not acknowledged as much as he deserved, but today he's virtually unknown. Part of why I find this story so fascinating is because of what an unlikely American hero he was. James was born with every disadvantage, and had every reason to feel resentment toward America. I can't help but see the irony of James interacting with Benedict Arnold, a man who had betrayed America because of perceived slights and injustices, as he was passed up for promotions and not given enough credit for victories. Benedict Arnold considered himself a victim long before he became a traitor. And then there was James, a true victim of injustice, and a man who received next to no recognition for his efforts. And yet, in the end, he was the one who stayed loyal to America. I wonder if part of the reason that Benedict Arnold trusted James so completely was because he could not fathom someone in James's situation not feeling angry toward America. He expected him to do the natural thing, which would have been to act in his own best interest, just as Benedict Arnold had done. But we see that their choices didn't have to do with their circumstances. It had to do with their characters. Thankless as his position was, James chose honor and loyalty, teaching us that some heroes labor in the light, but the truest ones labor in the shadows, changing the world without recognition. Which admittedly is unfair, but the whole concept of fairness is based around the idea that we should get what we deserve. But is that really what we want? If life were truly fair, a perfect man would never have suffered for the sins of mankind. He would not have been alone as he bled from every pore, nor been nailed to a cross. Aren't we grateful in this instance that we do not get what we deserve? If justice had its way, our sins would disqualify us for salvation. Instead, Christ took our stripes for us and submitted to indescribable suffering so he could have the power to right every wrong. And this he does more often than not without the gratitude that he deserves. Think about it this way. Isn't it amazing that Christ doesn't resent us? How easily he could hate us for causing him so much pain. But he doesn't. Paul taught that Christ became perfect through the things which he suffered, and that through his sufferings he became the source of eternal salvation to all that obey him. This teaches us that pain can actually be a good thing. It gives us compassion and strength that can be gained in no other way. Christ was prepared by his suffering, and we can be prepared to be his instruments through ours. It is only through Christ that we learn to not use our pain as a weapon to destroy, but as a tool to build. In The Princess Bride, there is this overarching theme of true love, and that it's the greatest power in the world, stronger even than death. The character Indigo, conversely, is motivated by revenge, bitter over what happened to his father. In the movie, Indigo has a happy ending, but in the book, he actually ends up dying from his duel with his father's killer, sacrificing his life to try and right a wrong. It's really a tragedy. What Indigo didn't understand was that someone had already given his life for that purpose, and his own life would have been better spent seeking to lift and heal than hunt and destroy. I just hope that when God allows us to pass through something hard, through no fault of our own, we can follow the example of the Son of God, who in the midst of his greatest agony replied to the Father, "Thy will be done," or in other words, "as you wish," which we learn from Wesley and Buttercup really means, "I love you." And there will come a day when unfairness will end, good deeds will have their just reward, and we will arrive at our happily ever after, if we only push forward, trusting that all things shall be for our good, and that God has the power to heal our hearts and ignite our faith.